The war goddess took a human prisoner, and fell for him against her will. Snow fell in silence over the burning colony. The flames of shattered human outposts sent plumes of black smoke spiraling into the gray sky, but above the carnage loomed something far greater, the obsidian shadow of the Divinity-class mothership. It stretched across the heavens like a continent in orbit, blotting out the weak sun, its underbelly glowing with the faint pulse of alien engines that no human mind could fully comprehend. On the ground, soldiers lay scattered in defeat. Those who had not been burned alive by plasma fire were dragged in chains, their armor charred, their eyes hollow. Humanity had been at war for less than a decade, and already it was losing worlds faster than they could be colonized. And now, here on this nameless frontier planet, the war was no longer about territory. It was about survival itself. Captain Elias Ward staggered forward, hands bound by magnetic cuffs that seared against his skin. Blood trickled from a gash across his brow, but he forced his steps steady. He wouldn't let them see him stumble. The alien guards prodded him toward the towering gates of their queen's throne chamber. Every step felt like being marched into the heart of a legend, because that's what she was. A legend whispered among both her enemies and her own people. The war goddess. The chamber doors opened with a hiss, and Elias's breath caught despite himself. The hall stretched like the nave of a cathedral, walls of living metal curving upward into luminous spires. Strange glyphs flowed across the surfaces, glowing faintly as though alive. At the far end, seated upon a throne grown from molten steel and bone, was the figure who had broken the backs of civilizations. She was taller than any soldier Elias had ever seen, nearly 9 feet, her frame both sleek and terrifyingly powerful. Her skin was patterned in iridescent scales that shifted in hue like liquid fire, and her hair, if it could be called that, was a cascade of crimson tendrils that shimmered like molten copper. Eyes like twin suns burned down upon him. The war goddess rose. "So," she said, her voice resonant, carrying a timbre that was both music and thunder. "One of the human commanders. They tell me you led your soldiers until the very end, refusing to surrender. Admirable. But foolish." Elias raised his chin. The alien guards behind him hissed, expecting him to kneel, but he locked his gaze with hers. "Funny," he rasped, his voice hoarse from smoke and blood. "For a god, you seem very interested in insects." The chamber fell silent. Her generals shifted uneasily. None dared speak to her that way. But the goddess, she laughed. A low, rolling sound that echoed off the living metal walls. "Insect," she repeated. "Yes. That is what your kind is. Fragile. Countless. Scattered in the void. And yet," she tilted her head, studying him like one might study an unfamiliar weapon. "You are unbroken." Elias's lips curled in something close to a smile. "Guess you don't know humans as well as you thought." For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, conqueror and prisoner, goddess and man. The war goddess's eyes narrowed, not in anger but in intrigue. Finally, she waved her hand. "Do not kill this one," she ordered her guards. "I wish to see how long his defiance lasts." The guards dragged Elias away, but he caught one last glimpse of her face as the doors closed. And though he hated himself for noticing, he realized that behind the fire and fury of those alien eyes, there was something else. Something almost curious. Something dangerous. The cell was carved from living metal, its walls pulsing faintly with a rhythm like the slow heartbeat of some buried titan. Elias sat against the wall, arms bound in energy cuffs that hummed with a low vibration. The air smelled faintly of ozone and something floral, alien, sharp enough to sting his nose. He'd been in worse cells, he told himself. On Mars, he had once been buried alive in the ruins of a collapsed bunker for 3 days before the rescue teams found him. He had survived that. He would survive this. But there was something different here, something heavier than the metal cuffs or the alien air. He could feel her presence even in her absence, the weight of those golden eyes on him. The war goddess. He clenched his jaw. He'd spat in the face of death more times than he could count, but for the first time, he wasn't sure if he had faced something truly beyond death. The door hissed open. Alien guards entered, tall and broad, their armor like dark carapace, their weapons humming with restrained plasma. "On your feet, human," one growled, though its mandibles clicked more than its lips moved. They dragged him down a long corridor that opened into what looked like an arena. Tiered balconies spiraled upward, filled with alien soldiers who hissed and roared at the sight of him. At the far end, upon a raised platform, stood the war goddess herself. Her voice rang out, amplified by the chamber itself. "Your kind clings to hope, even when all evidence tells you to yield. I would know the limits of this hope." And so, she raised her hand, and the crowd stilled. "You will be tested." The first trial was brute strength. A warrior stepped forward, towering even above Elias, armored in jagged obsidian plates. The crowd roared approval. The cuffs on Elias's wrists snapped open, releasing him. For a moment, the weight of freedom surged through him, only to be replaced by the heavier knowledge that he was expected to fight barehanded against a creature bred for war. The gong sounded. The alien lunged. Elias dodged. He wasn't stronger, he never would be, but he was faster. He ducked beneath the swing of the alien's blade, rolled across the sand, and came up with a jagged shard of stone in his hand. When the alien struck again, Elias slid under its guard and drove the shard into the gap beneath its ribs. The warrior staggered. The crowd gasped. Elias yanked the shard free, then used the creature's own momentum to send it sprawling to the ground. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the war goddess clapped once, the sound reverberating like thunder. "Clever," she said, her lips curling in something between a smile and a snarl. "Strength is not the only path to victory." The second trial was endurance. They brought him to a chamber where gravity weighed heavier than his bones had ever known. The air was thick, pressing against his lungs, each breath a battle. Alien soldiers stood around the perimeter, their scaled bodies unaffected by the crushing force. "Stand," the goddess commanded. He stood. His knees shook, his chest burned, but he stood. 1 minute became 2. 2 became 5. Sweat poured down his face, his vision blurred, but he refused to fall. When at last the gravity eased and he collapsed to the floor, the chamber erupted with murmurs. Even her own warriors looked unsettled. The final trial was intellect. They led him into a room inscribed with glowing glyphs. Strange puzzles of light and shifting metal floated in the air. The goddess herself stepped forward this time, her towering form casting long shadows across the chamber. "These are problems my scholars take years to solve," she said. "If your mind is as sharp as your defiance, prove it." Elias stared at the shifting constructs. They bent and wove like snakes, twisting in patterns that defied Euclidean geometry. His head throbbed. But as he watched, he began to see it. Not the solution, but the principle. The glyphs repeated in cycles, like waves overlapping. He traced the rhythm, ignored the details, and snapped a sequence of symbols into alignment. The construct froze, then dissolved into light. The goddess's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something more dangerous, fascination. "You should not have been able to do that," she murmured. Elias shrugged, though his heart still pounded. "Guess nobody told me I couldn't." The silence that followed was not the silence of contempt. It was the silence of a predator realizing its prey had fangs. Later, in the solitude of her private chambers, the war goddess dismissed her advisors. She stood before a wall of translucent metal that reflected her face like a mirror. For centuries, she had seen humans as vermin, an infestation to be cleansed from the stars. And yet the prisoner had endured, had defied, had solved. Her people whispered of extermination. She whispered to herself about the possibility. That night, when Elias was returned to his cell, she came to him alone. The guards remained outside. Why do you resist? She asked, her voice softer than before, though still carrying the weight of command. He met her gaze. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt from strain, but his voice was steady. Because if one of us resists, it means we haven't lost yet. Her breath caught, not that she let him see it. She straightened, masking the flicker of doubt. You are a fragile species, she said, almost to herself. And yet. There is steel in you. Not steel, Elias murmured, leaning back against the wall. Something better. Something your empire will never understand. What is that? He smiled faintly, closing his eyes. Hope. For the first time in 1,000 years, the war goddess found herself without an answer. The fortress ship trembled as distant explosions rolled through its hull. Elias snapped awake, chains rattling as he lifted his head. The ceiling pulsed faintly with alarm lights, the color a deep violet that cast everything in a strange, dreamlike glow. For a moment, he thought the aliens had finally come to execute him. But then the doors to his cell burst open, and she entered. The war goddess. Not in ceremonial armor, not draped across her throne, but in battle-worn plating streaked with scorch marks. A long slash ran across her side where alien blood, blue, like molten ice, seeped and hissed against the floor. She staggered. For the first time, Elias saw her falter. Stay back, she growled, clutching the wound. Yet her knees buckled, and before her guards could react, Elias had surged forward, catching her as she fell. Her weight was immense, her body burning with heat like living fire. She could have crushed him with a twitch of her hand. And yet, in that moment, she was simply vulnerable. You're bleeding, he said, his voice tight. Her mandible-like teeth bared in a grimace that was equal parts pain and defiance. It is nothing. I am immortal. Immortal doesn't bleed, Elias snapped. He tore a strip of fabric from his tattered uniform and pressed it against the wound. The guards hissed, weapons raised, but she raised a trembling hand to stop them. Her golden eyes burned into his. Confusion, fury, and something else he couldn't place swirled within them. You, save me, she whispered, as though the words themselves were alien to her tongue. That's what we do, Elias said. We don't leave people behind. Not even enemies. For a long moment, silence hung between them. The alarms blared, the ship trembled, but neither moved. His rough human hands pressed against her impossible skin, and for the first time in centuries, the war goddess felt the unthinkable, gratitude. She recovered quickly, of course. Her biology was far beyond human, and within hours the wound had sealed, leaving only a faint line of darker scales. But the memory of that moment lingered. She found herself standing on the balcony of her chambers, staring into the void of stars. Below, her empire stretched across the galaxy like a net of fire and steel. Dozens of species had been crushed beneath her fleets. She had been taught that strength was destiny, that weakness was infection, that mercy was failure. And yet a single human had shaken that foundation with nothing but defiance and a scrap of cloth. She told herself it was curiosity. That was all. She told herself humans were an anomaly, nothing more. Yet her feet betrayed her. Night after night, she found herself walking the long corridor to the prisoner's cell. At first, she spoke to him only in questions. What drives you to resist? What do you dream of when death surrounds you? Why did your kind scatter into the void when you were so unprepared for its teeth? And Elias, though wary, answered. Because freedom's worth bleeding for. Because even dying men can dream of better days. Because we'd rather risk the stars than rot in cages. His words were clumsy compared to her people's poetry, but they carried a weight hers did not. They were not recited dogma. They were lived truths. One night, as the ship drifted through the endless dark, she asked a question she had not meant to voice. Do you fear me? Elias chuckled softly, though the sound was rough. Every sane part of me does. And the rest? He met her gaze. In the faint light of the cell, his eyes were tired but unwavering. The rest just sees a woman trying real hard to convince herself she's only a goddess. The word struck her like a blade. A woman. No one had called her that in centuries. To her people, she was divinity incarnate. To her soldiers, she was terror and glory. To her enemies, she was death. But to this fragile, battered human, she was just a woman. For reasons she could not explain, she did not correct him. Her court noticed the change. The war goddess, distracted. The war goddess, lingering too long in the prisoner wing. The war goddess, sparring in words with a human when she should have been planning the next extermination. Whispers slithered through the halls like smoke. Some said she sought to break the human slowly. Others said she meant to dissect him, to learn his secrets. But the most dangerous whispers suggested something worse, that she was fascinated. One of her generals confronted her at last, a hulking creature with armor fused into his very bones. "My goddess," he said, kneeling but defiant. "This human infects your thoughts. He weakens your command. End him, before others doubt your divinity." The chamber grew silent. The war goddess rose, her crimson tendrils fanning like fire. Her voice thundered, shaking the very air. "Do not presume to command me." The general bowed lower, trembling. But the words had already been spoken, and she knew they were true. She was changed. Not weakened. Changed. And change, in an empire built on eternal conquest, was the greatest heresy. In the nights that followed, the goddess found herself pacing her chambers, torn between instinct and revelation. Elias haunted her thoughts. His voice, his stubborn smile, the way he had pressed cloth against her wound as though her life mattered. It was madness. Unthinkable. Yet when she closed her eyes, she saw not the faces of 1,000 conquered foes, but his. And for the first time in her immortal life, she was afraid not of losing her empire, but of losing what she had begun to feel. The breaking point came weeks later. The High Council sent word, the human was to be executed. His survival had been permitted long enough. His defiance was spreading among her troops like a contagion. Some had begun to wonder if perhaps the humans were not so weak after all. The order was clear. He must die. The war goddess stood before her throne, the council's message burning in her hand, and for the first time, she could not obey. That night, she went to him. No guards, no chains. Just her, towering above his small, battered frame. "They mean to kill you," she said. Elias raised an eyebrow, though his face was pale with exhaustion. "Figured it was only a matter of time. You should be terrified." He shrugged. "I stopped being terrified the day I signed up for this war. Fear doesn't help. Hope does." Her throat tightened. That word again. Hope. The poison and the cure. She leaned closer, her shadow swallowing him whole. "If I defy them, if I choose you, everything I have built will burn." "Then maybe it wasn't worth building," Elias said quietly. And in the silence that followed, the war goddess realized the truth she had been running from. She was no longer the unshakable queen of empires. She was a woman on the edge of choosing her heart over her throne. And when the dawn came, her choice was made. The execution chamber was a cathedral of steel. Vaulted ceilings curved overhead like the ribs of some colossal beast, every surface glowing faintly with the pulse of alien energy. Soldiers filled the tiers above, row upon row of armored figures watching in solemn silence. In the center of the chamber stood Elias, bound once more in chains of radiant metal. He had been stripped of his ragged uniform, clothed instead in a thin garment that offered no dignity. He looked like a man walking into his grave, and yet he held his head high, shoulders square, refusing to bend. At the far end, the war goddess descended from her throne. Her crimson tendrils shimmered like flame, her golden eyes unreadable. In her hand gleamed a ceremonial blade, an heirloom of her people, forged for the sole purpose of enacting judgment. The High Council's emissaries loomed behind her, their voices echoing through the chamber. This human's existence endangers the sanctity of the Empire. His defiance spreads like a disease. By decree of the Council, his death shall be a warning to all who resist. The crowd hissed approval. Elias met her gaze across the chamber. No fear. No pleading. Just that same maddening spark of defiance. "Guess this is it," he said, voice carrying even through the vast hall. "Not much of a trial." She stepped forward, the blade in her hand glowing hotter with each stride. The chamber fell silent. Every eye was on her. Every breath was held. And for a heartbeat, she almost believed she would obey. Almost believed she could raise the blade, strike him down, and remain the goddess they worshipped. But then she remembered his hands pressing against her wound. His voice said hope. His refusal to kneel, even when broken and bleeding. Her heart clenched, and the decision was made. The war goddess raised the blade, then spun, driving it through the chest of the nearest council guard. The chamber erupted in chaos. Her soldiers roared in shock, some leaping to their feet, others frozen by disbelief. Plasma fire streaked through the air. The emissaries shouted, demanding obedience, but their words drowned beneath the sound of rebellion. Elias staggered as his chains fell, shattered by her own hand. "Move," she barked, shoving him toward the nearest stair. "If you want to live, fight." He didn't hesitate. Grabbing the fallen guard's weapon, Elias fired into the crowd, bolts of light searing through the air. Soldiers fell, others rallied, but the chamber had already become a storm of fire and steel. The war goddess tore through her own warriors with terrifying grace, her blade a streak of molten light. For centuries, they had worshipped her as invincible, and now they discovered the truth of it, she was. But she was not theirs anymore. Elias fought beside her, every shot, every strike fueled not by strength but by the desperate stubbornness that had carried him this far. Together they carved a path through the chaos, two figures against an empire. They burst into the hangar bay, alarms shrieking overhead. Ships roared as pilots scrambled to intercept them. "There!" Elias shouted, pointing to a sleek vessel docked at the far end. They sprinted, plasma fire raining around them. Elias ducked, rolled, and fired back, while the goddess leapt, cutting down entire squads with sweeps of her blade. At last, they reached the vessel. She slammed her hand against the control panel, and the ship came alive, responding to her genetic command codes. "Get inside," she ordered. Elias stumbled aboard, collapsing into the co-pilot's seat. His chest heaved, his arms shaking, but his eyes blazed with something wild, something she had never seen in her own kind. Hope. The hangar doors opened, and the ship roared into the void. Pursuers followed, streaks of light cutting across the black sky. But the war goddess guided the vessel with inhuman precision, weaving through the chaos, her tendrils alive with focus. "Hold on," she growled, and the ship dove into hyperspace. Stars stretched into lines of light, and the pursuing fleet vanished behind them. Silence filled the cabin. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the thrum of the ship's core and their own ragged breathing. At last, Elias turned to her. His face was pale, streaked with dirt and blood, but his smile was real. "So, what now? A goddess and a soldier on the run?" She turned to face him. For the first time in centuries, she let the steel fall from her voice. "No," she said softly. "A woman and a man rewriting the stars." And in that fragile silence, somewhere between exhaustion and awakening, they both understood, the war they had known was over. A new one was just beginning, one fought not with fleets and fire, but with something far more dangerous. Together. The galaxy was vast, but word traveled faster than light. It began as whispers among the lower ranks of the fleet, Rumors that the invincible war goddess had turned her blade against her own. That she had spared a human, of all creatures. That she had fled into the void not as a conqueror, but as a traitor. At first, the High Council dismissed the stories as lies. But lies have a way of finding roots in truth, and soon entire battalions muttered of it behind sealed doors. Could it be true? Could the living goddess, the eternal blade of the Empire, have chosen a fragile, mortal human over them? The whispers grew into fire. On the fringes of conquered worlds, enslaved peoples looked to the stars with new eyes. If the war goddess herself could betray her empire, then perhaps the empire was not eternal. Perhaps it could bleed. Perhaps it could fall. Aboard a stolen vessel drifting between suns, Elias stood at the viewport, staring into the endless dark. His reflection stared back at him, hollow-eyed, scarred, but alive. More alive than he had ever felt. Behind him, she approached silently, her massive frame casting a shadow across the cabin. No throne, no crown, no retinue of soldiers. Just her. "The Empire will hunt us," she said. He nodded. "Let them. They will call me a traitor. They will call you a parasite." "Sounds about right," Elias said with a crooked grin. She studied him for a long moment, then turned her gaze to the stars. "Once, I believed I was eternal. That nothing could change me. But now," she trailed off, her crimson tendrils shimmering in the starlight. Elias glanced at her, his voice quiet. "Now you're human." The word struck her deeper than any blade. For the first time, she did not deny them. Days passed. Then weeks. Their vessel slipped between systems, avoiding patrols, living in the shadows of the Empire's gaze. They spoke little of what lay ahead. But in those long stretches of silence, something unspoken grew between them, something fragile, dangerous, and unstoppable. It was not peace. It was not war. It was something in between. It was a possibility. And across the galaxy, the legend spread. A goddess had fallen. A human had risen. Together they had vanished into the night, leaving only questions and whispers in their wake. If even gods could change, the people asked, then what else was possible? And somewhere, far from the reach of any fleet, far from the edicts of the High Council, a new story began, two fugitives in the dark, bound not by chains of empire, but by choice. A goddess and a man. A traitor and a soldier. A spark and a flame. And though neither knew where the path would lead, one truth burned brighter than any star. They would not walk it alone.